1976. Over the Black Sea, a Soviet MiG-23 pilot scans his primitive radar screen, squinting against the glare as his headset crackles with orders. He's thousands of meters in the air, flying a patrol pattern near Crimea, when his instruments suddenly flicker, then go quiet. No targets, no pings, just static. But the silence is a lie. Unbeknownst to him, far beyond the range he believes possible, an American F-14 Tomcat is already tracking him. Its radar operator, seated behind the pilot in the sleek twin-engine jet, calmly adjusts the controls of a system unlike anything the Soviets had ever seen before the AWG-9 radar. It isn't just looking straight ahead. It's scanning the entire sky, hundreds of kilometers wide, locking onto multiple targets simultaneously. Back at the command center, Soviet radar technicians argue over anomalies appearing on their ground-based scopes. Targets appear, disappear, reappear. Were they birds, ghosts, or something else? Then, at 85 miles out, the American crew flips a switch. One target call sign, Foxbat, is selected. A simulated Phoenix missile lock is engaged. In theory, the Soviet jet is already dead, all before it even knew it had been seen. This was not an isolated incident. It was the new norm. Over the next decade, F-14s would patrol the Mediterranean, Gulf of Sidra, and Persian Gulf, often shadowing Soviet formations at ranges previously thought impossible. The AWG-9 radar, paired with the AIM-54 Phoenix missile, created a standoff kill zone the Soviets could neither match nor evade. The terrifying part wasn't just that the Americans could see first. It was that they didn't need to close the distance anymore. One Soviet pilot, debriefed years later, described the experience in chilling terms. "We were ghosts, already killed, just not yet told." The U.S. Navy's new Guardian Angel and Agile, heavily armed interceptor capable of reaching Mach 2.3 and scanning from over 100 miles, had redefined air superiority, and in doing so, it shattered the very foundations of Soviet air defense doctrine. For Soviet generals watching their prized MiGs being killed before radar even beeped, one horrifying question echoed in every meeting: if they can see us this far out, what else can they do? For decades, Soviet air defense doctrine operated under a rigid framework: engage what you can see. Soviet radar systems like the P-14 Tall King and P-35 Barlock were engineered around a specific assumption detection meant visual or near-visual range. The MiGs, Sioux killers, and GCI ground-controlled intercept command posts all relied on the same premise: radar warning, vectoring, visual confirmation, and only then engagement. The room in which this doctrine was born had walls made of 1950s and 1960s technology. Soviet generals, many of whom had cut their teeth in World War II, believed in overwhelming speed and mass. A dozen MiG-21s, tightly coordinated, could swarm a target and fire volleys of infrared-guided missiles after achieving visual contact. That model worked when the enemies were bombers and dogfighters, but the F-14 changed the game before the Soviets realized they were playing by the wrong rules. The AWG-9 radar could track 24 targets simultaneously at distances beyond 100 miles. That's not an upgrade, it's a new dimension. With this radar, the Tomcat no longer needed to close in. It could see, classify, and kill before its adversary knew it was there. Soviet radar officers reviewing simulation tapes couldn't believe it. In practice runs, MiGs were destroyed while flying at full speed, on patrol, with perfect radio coordination. No warning, no lock alert, no heat signature, just elimination. The Soviet response: denial. Official memos dismissed the claims as Western exaggeration or unproven in actual combat. Their assumption was that no radar system could maintain reliable tracking of fast-moving targets across multiple altitudes in real time and still guide a long-range missile accurately. But that's exactly what the F-14's AWG-9 was doing, repeatedly, in intelligence circles. This was known as the detection illusion. The false belief that because the Soviets couldn't detect something, it must not be there. It was a dangerous mindset. In one infamous training scenario in the Pacific, a U.S. Navy Tomcat crew destroyed 6 inbound Soviet MiG-25s in simulation without crossing the 70-mile mark. The Soviet pilots were unaware until the exercise report reached their superiors, who then attempted to discredit it. One Soviet air marshal summed up the growing paranoia. If they are seeing us before we see them, then the very idea of air combat collapses. And that idea was about to collapse harder than anyone in Moscow could have imagined. In Soviet air doctrine, nothing was more sacred than ground-controlled intercept. From the earliest days of the Cold War, GCI had allowed Soviet forces to choreograph their air defenses like a ballet of radar vectors and pilot obedience. Aircraft were seen not as autonomous hunters, but as extensions of a centralized brain, the ground radar network. Soviet MiG-23 and MiG-25 pilots were trained to follow orders, not improvise. The ground would detect, classify, and assign targets. The pilot would execute the kill. It was efficient, especially in the age of short-range missiles and limited onboard radar. And it had worked, until it didn't. The arrival of the F-14 Tomcat and its AWG-9 radar system, and more importantly, the AIM-54 Phoenix missile represented a catastrophic break in this system. The American doctrine shifted the locus of control. Now, aircraft weren't just fighters, they were flying command centers. With look-down, shoot-down radar capabilities and autonomous tracking, the F-14 could bypass GCI entirely and make its own decisions in the sky. That was the break, in war games staged over the North Pacific. American carrier groups simulated engagements using F-14s to intercept incoming hostile aircraft. These simulations consistently showed one shocking pattern: the Soviet model of centralized command simply couldn't keep up. By the time a GCI station spotted an incoming threat and vectored MiGs toward it, the Tomcats had already locked, launched, and killed, often without ever being detected themselves. This forced a brutal realization inside the Soviet Ministry of Defense. Their entire strategic foundation, thousands of man-hours of training, decades of investment in ground radar grids, and entire wings of MiG pilots was now functionally obsolete against a single American aircraft. And the Phoenix missiles shattered the illusion completely. The AIM-54 had a range of over 100 miles, traveled at Mach 5, and carried an onboard radar that could guide itself. Once launched, it didn't need the F-14 to babysit it. It could follow a MiG across the sky while the Tomcat turned to address new threats. That changed air combat from one-on-one duels into long-range elimination matches where MiG pilots often didn't know they were being hunted until it was over. This concept, multi-target engagement at standoff distances, did not exist in Soviet doctrine. Their air combat manuals still emphasized cannon bursts and rear aspect IR missile shots. There was no training, no simulation, and no psychological preparation for being killed by a fighter that never came close. One defector from the Soviet VVS would later recount a chilling debrief. They told us our radars would see everything, that we would have warning. They lied. This wasn't just a tactical evolution. It was doctrinal obsolescence. In October 1982, deep over the North Pacific, an event unfolded that sent shockwaves through the Soviet Air Defense Command. It wasn't a shoot-down. It wasn't a bombing raid. It was, for all visible purposes, nothing. But that nothing changed everything. A Soviet long-range Tu-95 Bear reconnaissance aircraft had been dispatched to shadow the USS Enterprise battle group operating east of Kamchatka. Standard procedure. The Bear flew a straight route, flanked by MiG-23s operating from a forward base in the Kurils, with the Soviet Pacific Fleet listening closely. What they didn't know was that high above the clouds, 2 F-14 Tomcats from VF-1 Wolfpack had been vectored in, not by radar, not by AWACS, but by the Tomcat's own sensors, at over 80 miles out. The F-14 radar screens lit up multiple contacts. Formation flight. The AWG-9 computer instantly began sorting tracks and assigning threat priority. Without a single word from American command, the Tomcats locked on with Phoenix missiles. They never fired, but they didn't have to. Because at that moment, the Tu-95's radar warning receiver screamed. From the cockpit, the Soviet navigator saw the signal. A high-frequency spike indicating that a radar lock had been achieved. And not just any lock, an active one. Long range, unmistakable. Then a second tone, then a third. The bear was being targeted by weapon systems no Soviet radar had even seen yet. And yet, no American aircraft appeared on Soviet radar. The sky was empty. The Soviet ground station tried desperately to track the threat, sending repeated requests for visual identification. But the MiG escorts saw nothing. No contrails, no visual contacts, no radar pings, just the sound of warning receivers, screaming in the cockpit. Then the F-14s did something unthinkable. They flew directly over the bear's flight path, descending to visual range, then pulled up into a high yo-yo maneuver, flashing their insignia and peeling away into the stratosphere. It was a message. The bear returned to base immediately. No shots were fired, but the implications were devastating. The Americans had demonstrated a lethal advantage. They had tracked, intercepted, and dominated the airspace while remaining invisible to the most sophisticated Soviet sensors. When news reached the Soviet General Staff, the response was confusion, followed by silence. Radar logs were reviewed. Pilot debriefs were classified. The incident was never acknowledged publicly, but it echoed in every war game that followed. The question wasn't just how the Americans did it, it was why they could do it at all. And the USSR couldn't even see it coming. That was the first impossible event, and it shattered the illusion of radar dominance. The initial Soviet response to the Pacific incident was not alarm but disbelief. In Moscow, the Air Defense Command Staff dismissed the Tu-95 crew's report as either mistaken identity or Western psychological warfare. A rogue signal, faulty instrumentation, pilot nerves, nothing more. In the high-ceilinged halls of the Ministry of Defense, radar supremacy was a given. Since the 1950s, Soviet doctrine had leaned heavily on ground-controlled interception and radar-guided defenses. The concept was simple: if something was in the air, Soviet radars would see it, and if they could see it, they could kill it. So the idea that an American fighter could lock onto a Soviet aircraft at 100 miles without itself being seen was unacceptable. Not technologically impossible, but doctrinally impossible. Soviet strategists had spent decades building layered radar networks across Eurasia, complete with long-range SAM systems, airborne early warning platforms, and redundancy drills. The assumption was clear: the West may strike first, but the USSR would always see it coming. But in the aftermath of the 1982 event, cracks began to appear. The Tu-95's ELINT team had recorded precise radar frequencies, ones consistent with the AWG-9. That alone was disturbing. But what disturbed Soviet analysts more was the detection range. The Tu-95's own radar systems were designed to detect high-altitude fighters, yet the F-14s never appeared. Only their radar beams had left a trace. Soviet radar engineers at NII Radio and Aerospace Defense Institute were summoned for urgent consultations. Could the Americans really project radar power without being detected themselves? Could their signal processing eliminate radar shadows? Was this some new form of beamforming? Still, the official stance remained frozen. The Politburo refused to act on one unconfirmed incident. Worse, any hint that Soviet air defense could be outmatched risked undermining confidence in the very systems that defended Moscow itself. Propaganda had long boasted of impenetrable skies, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Suggesting otherwise, especially based on a single intercepted tone, was politically unacceptable. Instead, Moscow buried the report. The Tu-95 crew received no commendation. Their warnings were struck from briefing summaries, and the General Staff issued quiet instructions. Any future Phantom Lock incidents were to be reported directly to command and classified immediately. No leaks, no panic, no change. In doing so, the Soviet hierarchy committed a critical mistake. They assumed the problem was an outlier, that their radar screen, the one blank during the F-14 flyover, was a glitch. But it wasn't. It was the future. And it was coming fast. In the aftermath of the Tu-95 incident, Soviet aerospace analysts scrambled to form a counter-theory, one that wouldn't require overturning decades of radar doctrine. The hypothesis they settled on was deceptively simple. The Americans must be using airborne deception. The leading theory held that the F-14 Tomcat wasn't truly tracking targets at 100 miles. Instead, the U.S. Navy was staging radar mirages using specialized ECM pods to bounce or fake radar returns, giving the illusion of a lock-on. According to this logic, the F-14 was projecting phantom pulses that confused Soviet eland gear into thinking it was being targeted. To the old guard in the Soviet Union, this was a comforting explanation. It framed the event not as a leap in American capability, but as an elaborate trick. Soviet defense journals published sanitized versions of this theory, often framing the F-14's long-range kill capacity as overstated and based on staged training scenarios. It was classic misdirection, an attempt to reassure internal audiences that nothing had changed. In fact, the Soviet Air Force even commissioned an experimental ECM test using their own MiG-25s and Yak-28PP electronic warfare aircraft over the Caspian Sea. A trial was run simulating a scenario where a MiG-25 would appear to lock onto a target beyond visual range using jamming and spoofed radar bursts. The results were inconclusive and largely irrelevant. The American system wasn't a bluff. Unknown to the Soviets, the F-14 Tomcat's AN/AWG-9 radar was revolutionary not because of trickery, but because of raw processing power. It could track 24 targets simultaneously, identify 6 as threats, and launch 6 AIM-54 Phoenix missiles, all while maintaining real-time situational awareness at 100 miles or more. No deception, just range and computing power. But the Soviets clung to the ECM mirage theory. They added new jamming protocols, trained Tu-128 and Su-15 crews to expect false radar spikes, and built countermeasures for illusions that didn't exist. They saw phantoms in the air, not the predator quietly watching from beyond their reach. And in doing so, they prepared for the wrong war. With the ECM deception theory slowly unraveling under operational inconsistencies, Soviet Aerospace Command pivoted to a second explanation, one rooted in raw altitude. If the Americans weren't faking signals, then perhaps the F-14's radar was simply exploiting an unfair advantage, the high ground of the stratosphere. The theory suggested that the F-14's radar effectiveness was due to its exceptionally high cruising altitude, an edge in line-of-sight physics. Soviet intercept doctrine had long understood that radar range increased with altitude. If the Tomcat was operating at 50,000 feet or above, then perhaps the radar horizon was naturally extended, allowing early target detection without any technological leap. To test the theory, Soviet Air Command ran elevation-optimized sorties using MiG-25 interceptors, flying near their ceiling of 65,000 feet. MiG pilots were ordered to monitor radar returns on simulated bomber approaches and report range acquisition data. On paper, the experiment made sense: match height with height and neutralize any theoretical advantage. But the theory fell apart under real-world scrutiny. Even at high altitudes, Soviet radar systems failed to match the tracking distance and multi-target resolution the F-14 demonstrated. Worse, their own radar systems, especially those onboard legacy aircraft like the Su-15, struggled with resolution clutter and target separation above 30 miles. The Soviet Air Force was chasing performance metrics they couldn't match. Even if their aircraft climbed high enough, their radar was decades behind in filtering capabilities. Meanwhile, the Tomcat's AN/AWG-9 system used advanced pulse Doppler tracking and track-while scan modes, enabling it to pick targets from clutter even when the target was flying low or masked by terrain. This second wrong theory spawned a budget sink. Soviet engineers began developing high-altitude AWACS prototypes and interceptor drones based on balloon-assisted launches, attempting to replicate the high-ground radar envelope concept. None reached production. Soviet defense literature in the 1980s still referred to this line of thinking, using phrases like strategic altitude prioritization to mask a deeper truth. They had no equivalent system. In hindsight, the altitude theory was a comforting illusion. It suggested the F-14 wasn't unbeatable, just well-positioned. But radar superiority was not a matter of altitude. It was a matter of architecture. While the Soviets soared higher, the Americans saw further. And every time a Phoenix missile left the rails of an F-14, the difference wasn't in feet, but in decades. Soviet intelligence had always prided itself on technical espionage, from atomic secrets to missile telemetry. Their ability to steal American designs was legendary, but in the case of the F-14 Tomcat, and more specifically its radar system, the KGB and GRU hit a wall they couldn't breach. From the earliest deployment of the F-14 aboard the USS Enterprise in 1974, Soviet surveillance trawlers, satellites, and signal intercept teams had attempted to decode its combat architecture. They followed every carrier deployment, monitored test flights off the coast of California, and even studied airshow appearances in Iran before the 1979 revolution. But the most critical element, the radar signature and electronic warfare capabilities, remained locked behind an invisible curtain. The heart of this failure was the AN/AWG-9 radar, a revolutionary pulse Doppler system with track-while-scan capability. Unlike Soviet radars, which could track one or two targets at a time, the AWG-9 could detect, lock, and simultaneously guide weapons onto 6 targets up to 100 miles away, even at low altitude. For Soviet engineers used to the MiG-23's mechanically steered radar or the primitive flat-plate design of the Su-15, it seemed like magic. Soviet intelligence misjudged the system's origin, initially believing the Americans had adapted naval surface radar for air use. Dozens of man-years were wasted analyzing SPY-1A and earlier Aegis-related blueprints, trying to reverse engineer non-existent overlaps. The truth was simpler and more devastating. The AWG-9 wasn't a spin-off of a shipborne system. It was purpose-built for the Tomcat, a joint effort between Hughes and Grumman that fused airborne radar innovation with digital fire control far ahead of its time. Worse still, the signal profile of the AWG-9 was elusive. American squadrons used rigorous emissions control MCON procedures during peacetime flights, meaning Soviet LNT stations along Kamchatka, Vladivostok, and East Germany rarely captured usable telemetry. What little data they did intercept was often encrypted or muddied by decoys. In a rare intelligence coup, Soviet agents obtained technical data from Iran after the Shah's fall in 1979. Iran had purchased 79 F-14s before the revolution, and Soviet technicians eagerly swarmed over crash sites and disabled aircraft during the Iran-Iraq War. But to their frustration, most of the AWG-9 components had been either removed or destroyed by U.S. advisors before the handover. Those few radars that remained were sabotaged by self-destruct circuits or software corruption that rendered them useless. Even efforts to analyze Phoenix missile electronics yielded dead ends. The missile's semi-active radar homing technology relied on complex guidance loops only the AWG-9 could initiate. Without a working F-14 radar, the Phoenix was just an expensive tube. Ultimately, Soviet intelligence failed not because they weren't looking, but because they were looking in the wrong direction. They underestimated how far ahead American electronics had surged. The KGB reported gradual gains in radar parity into the mid-1980s, an illusion fed by MiG-31 prototypes and S-300 deployments. But these systems, while impressive, never matched the Tomcat's integrated kill chain. It was the ultimate failure of espionage to chase a shadow and never grasp the source. The F-14 Tomcat wasn't a fighter. It was an airborne ambush. To understand why Soviet command feared it so deeply, one must stop thinking in terms of dogfights and start thinking in networks. The F-14 was not merely fast and agile, it was the forward claw of a much larger American kill web, a system that fused radar, missiles, carriers, satellites, and data links into a single strike organism. At its core was the AN/AWG-9 radar. It used a powerful pulse Doppler signal to track targets below the horizon, discriminating between actual aircraft and ground clutter. Its range over 115 miles in optimal conditions allowed the Tomcat to detect and track enemy formations long before being seen. The Soviets, using the MiG-25's RP-25 Smerch radar, couldn't match this. Their system was fast but blind, capable of high-speed interception, but not of building a picture of the sky. What made the F-14 lethal wasn't just the radar, it was what came next, the AIM-54 Phoenix. Each Phoenix missile was the length of a torpedo and weighed over 1,000 pounds. It could fly at Mach 5, climb above 100,000 feet, and then dive onto targets from space. More critically, the Tomcat could guide 6 of them simultaneously. With track-while-scan radar mode, a single F-14 could engage multiple bombers or fighters without breaking formation. In 1981, a Navy test at Point Mugu saw a Tomcat fire 6 Phoenix missiles at 6 drones flying in formation. 5 were destroyed, and 1 was declared a mission kill after the missile veered close enough to disintegrate its control surfaces. It wasn't theory. It worked. Soviet naval commanders knew what this meant. If a bomber group of 2 22M backfires approached a U.S. carrier battle group, and even one Tomcat launched early, there would be no battle, just 6 fireballs at 90 miles out. But the true system extended far beyond the aircraft. The U.S. Navy built the entire carrier group around the idea of layered defense. E-2 Hawkeye radar planes extended the radar horizon hundreds of miles. Surface ships with Aegis systems created overlapping missile zones. Submarines tracked enemy fleets before the first radar ping was even sent. The F-14 was the outer blade. Its long loiter time, speed, and weapons load allowed it to patrol distant zones, while always tethered to command via data links and carrier coordination. When paired with the Hawkeye's early warning and the Phoenix's reach, the system became something the Soviets had no counter to, a first-strike interceptor that didn't have to see its targets to kill them. In 1983, during Operation Urgent Fury in Grenada, F-14s performed combat air patrols that dissuaded Cuban MiGs from even approaching contested airspace. They were invisible on radar, yet always seen when it was too late. And the pilots. Many were just out of Top Gun school, trained not in close-range theatrics but in beyond-visual range tactics, electronic warfare, and radar deception. While Soviet pilots trained for visual merges and coordinated formations, American aviators were being taught how to eliminate a squadron before anyone shouted Fox 3. By the mid-1980s, Soviet simulations showed that even a group of MiG-23s or Su-15s would be unable to close with a carrier group guarded by F-14s and Phoenix missiles. Their only hope was overwhelming numbers or coordinated cruise missile strikes plans that, once decoded, always included the note, "Losses heavy, unavoidable." It was not just hardware, it was a doctrine. One built on information dominance, precision interception, and electronic invisibility. The F-14 didn't just fly above the battlefield, it erased it before it began. The Soviet air defense grid, vast and intricate, had no equivalent. Their planes chased targets. The F-14 killed them before they knew it was there. This wasn't a dogfight. It was chess, and the Tomcat was moving 5 pieces at once. In the summer of 1984, over the frigid North Pacific, the U.S. Navy staged what appeared to be a routine war game. 3 carrier strike groups simulated defense against a massive bomber threat, complete with radar jamming, low-level cruise missiles, and mock Soviet attack profiles. Watching from afar via trawlers and listening posts, Soviet observers prepared to collect valuable signals intelligence. They collected humiliation instead. Unknown to the Soviets, the exercise included a classified demonstration F-14 Tomcats would intercept mock Soviet bombers represented by U.S. Navy intruders and P-3 Orions at extreme range using live radar tracking and inert Phoenix missile profiles. The bombers were launched in staggered waves from multiple directions, mimicking a Tu-22M backfire attack on a carrier group. They came in low and fast, shielded by ECM noise and decoy bursts. The F-14s saw them all. 30 minutes before the first wave reached within 150 miles of the carrier. E-2C Hawkeyes detected them. The information fed directly into the AWG-9 radars of patrolling Tomcats. Within 5 minutes, 4 F-14s had locked onto the inbound targets at a range of 90 miles. Pilots simulated the launch of 16 AIM-54 Phoenix missiles Fox 3 and turned away without closing distance. Observers aboard the faux bombers were stunned. Their systems didn't detect the F-14s until the moment the mock missiles would have struck. Not one bomber made it within 60 miles of the carrier. Soviet ELINT trawlers picked up the chaos. Dozens of radar signals, strange IFF codes, encrypted voice bursts. None of it made tactical sense to Soviet analysts. They didn't know what had happened. All they knew was that an entire simulated bomber attack had failed to register a hit. The message was clear. And it wasn't subtle. Within weeks, Soviet Air Defense Command quietly issued a new directive. All Tu-22M missions in contested airspace must include dedicated escort fighters and decoy waves. The memo didn't mention the F-14 by name, but it didn't have to. In war rooms across Moscow, a darker realization took root. The Americans had made distance irrelevant. The F-14 wasn't just an interceptor, it was a sword that reached across the horizon. Invisible, precise, and untouchable. Their bombers were no longer weapons, they were targets. And in that summer exercise, the F-14 didn't just intercept aircraft. It intercepted an entire doctrine. It dismantled the idea that sheer numbers and speed could overwhelm American defenses. That was the day Soviet generals stopped laughing at the Tomcat, and they never laughed again for decades. Soviet air doctrine leaned heavily on saturation. Waves of bombers, clouds of missiles, swarms of MiGs. Quantity was the answer to every Western advantage. If the Americans built a better radar, the Soviets would simply build more targets. If their pilots trained harder, then Soviet regiments would overwhelm them with volume. The F-14 made that theory laughable. With its ability to detect and engage threats at distances that were previously science fiction, the Tomcat turned the entire air defense equation on its head. A single F-14 with Phoenix missiles could theoretically engage 6 aircraft before the enemy even saw it. Backed by E-2 Hawkeyes and surface radar assets, one combat air patrol could eliminate a full Soviet bomber wing. What crushed Soviet confidence wasn't just the technology, it was the economy behind it. The U.S. could afford to deploy these systems in volume, to train pilots on full simulators, to fuel hundreds of hours of flight time per year. Meanwhile, Soviet radar operators struggled with outdated schematics and bureaucratic doctrine. The AWG-9 radar's multi-target tracking created a psychological shift that extended beyond fighter combat. It forced the Soviets to reconsider the survivability of every asset, every Tu-95 Tu-22M, and even future platforms like the Blackjack bomber. With AWACS integration, the Americans had created a battlefield where speed and stealth were no longer mutually exclusive, and where Soviet aircraft became flashing targets the moment they left the runway. Inside the Kremlin, whispers of phantom kills began circulating. Accounts of long-range engagements, kills before visual contact, and even entire flights disappearing from radar screens haunted briefings. Engineers scrambled to develop jamming pods, chaff clouds, and even long-range decoys, but nothing changed the math. The U.S. had redefined air superiority. And with the F-14, America didn't just intercept bombers. It intercepted the future of war and claimed it first. 30 years after the Cold War's end, the F-14 is no longer flying for the United States. Its swept-wing silhouette has been retired, replaced by fifth-generation stealth fighters and unmanned systems. But in the minds of former Soviet officers, The Tomcat never left. Today, Russian defense analysts still reference it in briefings not as a current threat, but as a turning point. The moment when air combat stopped being about numbers and started being about reach, sensors, and first strike. The F-14 remains a case study in what happens when a platform perfectly integrates detection, speed, and lethality. Modern Russian pilots flying Su-35s and MiG-31s still train with scenarios built around standoff ranges and beyond visual range kills concepts pioneered by the AWG-9 and Phoenix decades ago. They fly against American and NATO doctrines that assume seamless radar tracking from dozens of airborne platforms, satellites, and ground stations. The F-14 didn't just change the Cold War, it shaped the post-Cold War world. Even Iran, the only other nation to fly the Tomcat, kept its F-14s flying long after the U.S. mothballed them, scavenging parts and upgrading systems. The Soviets had once laughed at the idea of a long-range interceptor so complex and expensive that only a few could be built. But that interceptor survived decades of technological evolution, and the doctrine behind it lives on. Every time a NATO radar lights up a stealth aircraft from 80 miles out, every time a Russian pilot is forced to retreat before crossing a no-fly line, and every time a new missile is tested with fire-and-forget BVR capability, it's a whisper from the ghost of the F-14. Not the end of war, but the end of war the Soviet way.